Hi, I'm Brad Newcombe, and you're watching Pressure Point. We all know how the Christian church has divided and redivided into denominations, and sometimes it's been amicable and other times it's been bitter. Well, I think it's good news to hear that two denominations are working more closely together and talking together. And I'm talking about the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Canada. And they've been having conversations for some time toward full communion. And with me to talk about what this has meant and what it might mean, I have Bishop Ray Schultz with the Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Canada and the Reverend Dr. Richard Leggett, who is Professor of Liturgical Studies at Vancouver School of Theology. Well, welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really good to have you here. And I'm going to start off really basic. And maybe I'll start with you, Richard.
Sure.
Just in a few words, where and how and why did the Anglican Church come to be, and sort of what is an Anglican? What is the Anglican Church? Maybe we'll start with the church, not the Anglican.
I was going to say, what
That's
is an Anglican? Is a broad question.
pretty wide swath.
Yes. The Anglican Church began, of course, in England in the middle part of the 16th century. It was part of that great Reformation of the churches that took place in Western Europe. Often people associate the beginnings of the Church of England with, quote, Henry VIII's divorce, but in reality there had been a long period of theological debate in England, fueled in part by a discussion of the ideas of Martin Luther. And so in the 1540s, the church began to take some steps to separate itself from the government of the Church of Rome. And then in later years, particularly during the reign of Elizabeth I, began to develop its own character.
But I really must confess that I like the Henry VIII. I mean, it gives it a much sort of
It's a great
saltier,
story.
spicier beginning.
Yes, it is. It gives it a spicier beginning, but to understand the Anglican Church, you have to actually go back several hundred years before Henry.
Oh,
So
really?
Henry really was the catalyst for what became a significant change.
Okay.
But the Church of England had long been somewhat independent, of an independent mind theologically, and so when the Reformation of the 16th century rolled around, it was very it was something that was just waiting to happen.
And there are now Anglicans around the world.
Yes.
In the States, they're called Episcopalian. Is that right?
In the States, they're called Episcopalians. There are about 70 million Anglicans throughout the world. The majority of Anglicans are not of Western European descent. The vast majority of Anglicans now live in Africa and in Asia. And the mother language of many Anglicans is no longer English, but various other African and other languages. So the whole shape of our communion has changed radically over the last 450 years.
Okay. So now, Ray, a little bit about the Lutheran Church in general, but also the Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Canada, because that sounds very particular, very specific. A little bit about where and how that began.
Well, the Lutheran Church began with the Reformation in Germany under the leadership of Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon and others. One of the dates that we use to mark that is 1530.
Right.
Up until then, Lutherans were part of the Western Catholic Church, but due to doctrinal disagreements that couldn't be resolved, Martin Luther was excommunicated, and so the churches in that part of Germany began an independent life of their own. They didn't intend to be a separate church body, they just suddenly found themselves having to do that. So then the movement spread north to the Scandinavian countries. To connect the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada with that, as immigrants came to North America from Germany and from the Scandinavian countries, they brought their church life with them. Wherever they settled in communities, and then they started churches. Sometimes they sent back to the homeland for clergy. That's how they began. And later on they built seminaries and trained their own. Because they were very isolated, they operated as independent church bodies. And so there was a time when there were 100 independent Lutheran church bodies in North America.
My goodness. I was right when I said that Christian denominations have divided and redivided into many different denominations.
We sure have. So then they started merging together, and they merged together first along ethnic lines. All the Norwegians got together, and all the Danes, or most of them. The Germans never seemed to be able to settle on just one, and so there were many German synods in North America for a long time. But we've continued to merge, and in 1986, all of the Lutherans in Canada, except for Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, formed what we now call the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. We have about 800 congregations across the country, and about 1,000 clergy altogether. Our head office is in Winnipeg.
Okay. So now these two denominations, the Anglican Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, having some conversation toward what's called full communion and other things, but we'll get to a definition of that. But first of all, what's driving the conversation? Richard, maybe?
Well, I think the first thing that's driving the conversation is, as Ray mentioned, neither of our churches ever understood themselves to be creating a separate church body. We understood ourselves to be reforming movements within the Catholic Church. And so we have always sought to enhance the unity of the Church, not to foster kind of breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces. So both of us come from traditions that have a long commitment to the unity of the Church. I think the other thing that is driving it is really the development of the World Council of Churches and the whole ecumenical movement beginning in the 1920s and certainly gaining steam after the Second World War.
So now, and when you say full communion, like sort of that's sort of this brief sort of synopsis of what your talks are, but what is it you're talking about doing? I mean, what does full communion mean, and what would that look like?
It means that each of us acknowledge the other's church body as being a place where the gospel is proclaimed, where the apostolic tradition has been maintained. In other words, they're equal church bodies, and the teaching is interchangeable.
And it will allow us also to be in a relationship where clergy from one church can officiate in the other church, and vice versa. At the present time, that's not permissible except in very, very narrow situations.
Now, what does that mean, officiate?
Well, it means that, for example, if I'm the rector of an Anglican parish and I go on holiday, and right next door to me is a Lutheran congregation, I might make an arrangement with the local Lutheran pastor to actually cover the services at my parish. It means that we can celebrate the Eucharist, preside at each other's Eucharists. It means that if our agreement goes forward, that we would share in ordinations, so that when bishops are ordained in the Anglican Church, Lutheran bishops will participate, and likewise, when Lutheran bishops are installed, Anglican bishops will
So is there going to be anything different about the two of you then? I mean, are you going to be one?
Well, we're not going to merge. We're going to continue to be two separate church bodies, but we're certainly going to work closer together, and that's bound to have an effect on the two of us. What that effect will be, we can't tell just yet.
Now, what about, I don't know what the sort of church attendance is like in the Anglican and Lutheran churches in Canada generally, but I do know that, I know from my own experience having worked in ecumenical ministries, particularly in northern Quebec, where, when there was a choice of no church or everybody coming together, literally every Protestant denomination could come together. So the other thing, as I have to say, is part of it the fact that numbers are smaller, and is it harder to get ministers and priests and so on? Is that one of the things that drives this?
I don't really think so. It certainly makes it easier, or it certainly sets the stage for some agreements that we have.
And people are not going to complain as much because,
No.
it's easy to be separate when you're strong and wealthy
Exactly.
and all those kinds of things.
But I think, Brad, to put it in perspective, we've been talking about working together and have been working together long before the demographic shift in participation.
Right.
There's a long history of joint pastoral charges in Canada involving Anglicans, Lutherans, United Church, Presbyterians. So we have a long history of working together when that seems to be the best way to go forward. I think that what's driving our movement towards full communion is that we've discovered in the Lutherans a family of churches that is very much like our own family, and that some of the things that have kept us from working more closely together are, I won't say artificial barriers, but they're barriers that no longer need separate us. And so we've really decided that the time is ripe for us to say, this is not necessary. We can do a much closer work.
Well, see, I remember one time working as part of an Anglican United team, and a person actually in a ministry, and feeling that this was something to be quite sort of proud about in some ways, because I sort of appreciated the subtleties of tradition and so on. And I can remember saying that to someone who I just met, who obviously didn't have any particular church or Christian background, and they said to me, "What's Anglican? What's United?" So one of the questions I would like to ask you, Ray, then is like, what are the significant differences that have kept Anglicans and Lutherans, but not even Anglicans and Lutherans, other denominations as well, apart? Like, what are the things that have kept us apart?
Well, it's easier to answer the Anglican-Lutheran question first.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, and that's what we're focusing on here.
The Anglican Church is an Episcopal church, which means it has a hierarchical structure, whereas the Lutheran Church has, up until now, been a church where there's only one order of ministry, and bishops are not ordained beyond the original ordination. So that's been a difference, but we're all changing our mind about how that expresses itself. The Lutheran Church has defined itself primarily through its theology and its doctrinal confessional statements, whereas the Anglican Church has tended to define itself through its liturgy and its traditions.
Okay, I can understand the difference. There's a lot in that statement. I think it's very well said, but a lot in that statement. So say that again. I just want to sort of get that, because there's a lot to digest.
Okay, so the Lutherans tend to identify themselves in theological terms.
Okay.
They had to rationalize who they were
Right.
Before a Catholic court, and so they defined their teachings in various documents that were presented in court, and so those documents have defined who we are, Lutheran Confessions.
Okay.
And we put them all together in a book called the Book of Concord.
Right, okay.
Whereas the Anglican Church was not in that same defensive position, and so they never found it necessary to do that. So they have more identity through their continuous tradition, whereas the Lutherans in Germany were separated from the tradition of the Western Catholic Church.
Okay. And I think that's an important historical difference. The differences between Anglicans and Lutherans have primarily been historical, not theological.
Okay, and so where do that, give me the history, or so where do those history events take place?
Well, what happened in England was when Henry VIII decided to take authority and wrest authority in England rather than in Rome, unlike the situation in Germany, most of the bishops of the Church of England, with a few exceptions, said, fine, this is acceptable, we will go forward with this settlement. So what happened was you have an intact church, the former Catholic Church in England simply becomes the Church of England and moves together into this new future. And as a result, we were able to preserve our traditional structure of bishops, priests, and deacons. We were able to preserve the structures of our parishes and our dioceses. And the main thing that then bound us together was this remarkable document that appeared in 1549, or the first of them that appeared in 1549, the Book of Common Prayer. This book of common worship, which then shaped Anglicanism. And so we've tended to define ourselves in a continuous tradition of worship and in a continuous tradition of witnessing to the Catholic order of the Church, the traditional Catholic order. But we've often found ourselves, when we hear Lutherans speaking, hearing echoes of our own theology. What we didn't see were bishops in the historic tradition, as we had them, but our histories were different, you see.
Right, so histories were different, that's fair enough. And we're in a very different time in history now for the Christian church. And many people say we're in a time of post-denominationalism. And that's certainly my experience, is that people don't feel any particular allegiance to particular traditions or denominations, and especially when you're in a first or second generation of people that have no church experience and increasingly less and less Christian memory even. I mean, sort of that we've moved from Christianity being the religion of the culture and so on. And that people look for something that touches them personally, spiritually, a kind of human transformation, spiritual growth, community of faith kind of thing. Okay, so to me, I mean, in a time of post-denominationalism, all these kind of differences, which I appreciate historically and theologically, in people's everyday practice and experience of Christian faith and Christian living, does this stuff make any difference, or is it just for the theologians and the historians?
Yeah.
Or for the bishops, maybe we should go
So,
first.
I mean, I guess that's I mean, really, and I must confess that I feel quite comfortable with the two of you to be able to put you on the spot like that.
Well, yes, it does make a difference, but because we live in a post-Christian era where people no longer have a Christian memory, the way in which we encounter the general public has to be different. I mean, the spiritual traditions that we've developed over the centuries are very profound, and they've been tested, and a lot of stuff has been shucked off. And so this deep historical tradition that we have can't just be thrown away.
Right.
Any more than we would throw away the Bible because it now happens to be old literature.
Right.
What we're being faced with is that we have to learn a different way to interpret ourselves to a different group of people.
Right. And that we can never assume understanding or knowledge or experience in the tradition itself.
No.
Right.
But I also think that it needs to be said that I recognize that we live in a supposed post-denominational age.
Right.
But I think that there is something important that Anglicans and Lutherans have to say about what it means to live the Christian life. It's true that denominational loyalty tends not to be the case these days, where if you were raised one tradition, you might easily find yourself in another. But that does not mean that our two traditions don't have something very important to say about how to live that life. And what we've discovered is that the idea of a common worship, which Lutherans and Anglicans share, that common worship which has roots, but at the same time opportunities for growth and for new things to happen. An approach to the Bible which says it's right to ask questions about the Bible. It's right to examine the Bible and ask what is the Word of God.
Now, is that new? Is that new in the Lutheran or Anglican traditions to sort of say it's right to ask questions about the Bible or that kind of thing?
Not new to me.
No.
And it's definitely not new to the Anglican tradition.
No.
We've always struggled to say how are these words about God the Word of God.
Right. Now, I just want to ask the two of you personally, because I mean you're obviously very committed to and giving your lives to not just the Christian faith but your particular traditions. So, how does this conversation of moving toward full communion between the Anglican and Lutheran churches in Canada grab you, right?
Well, I feel passionate about it. I'm also Richard's good friend.
Right, okay.
I was a campus chaplain at UBC for 10 years, where Vancouver School of Theology was like my spiritual home. And so I've spent a lot of my ministry building relationships with people of other denominations, but particularly the Anglican Church. And so I'm excited about developing more communion with the Anglican Church than before. I see this as family members coming together who haven't known each other very well in the past, and we're deepening that relationship. So I feel passionate about it.
And I know, Richard, you've been very involved, for some time in conversations at various levels of the two traditions. So how does it make you feel?
Well, my first experience of Anglican-Lutheran relations was when I was a senior seminarian, my last year of seminary, when the local, at that time, American-Lutheran parish asked me to come and moderate a 4-week series on moral issues. And the reason they thought they'd ask an Anglican seminarian is that they could get mad at me and not at each other if they disagreed. But what I discovered there was a wonderful sense of hospitality, a warmth of community, which I had, quite frankly, did not experience in some other traditions. And that warmed my heart. And over the years, so it's been over 20 years that personally I've been involved in this. The one thing I appreciate about my Lutheran brothers and sisters is because of the strong theological tradition within Lutheranism, they always ask me to make sure what I mean. And they ask the right questions of me. And in doing so, help me discover something about myself as an Anglican, but also help me discover something about myself as a Christian. So I appreciate the strong theological tradition that says, okay, this is all well and good. You say this in the Eucharistic liturgy, but what do you mean by it? And it forces me to think.
Now, are people, lay people, and some pastors and clergy, sort of grassroots, are they engaged in these kinds of conversations as well?
Oh, very definitely. So, for example, if you go to Jasper, Alberta, you'll find a Lutheran pastor who's also the rector of the local Anglican parish, two separate congregations, but they're together. There's another congregation in Alberta, in the northern part of Alberta, that recently had a choice. They were in a shared ministry, had an opportunity to split, and they had the finances and everything, chose to stay together. Wow. That they liked what they're doing. There's the situation over in
Port Alberni,
where
the Lutheran Church has recently gone into a shared ministry with the Anglican Church, and both communities are being served by the Anglican rector there. Two of our seminary graduates went to Bigger, Saskatchewan, one to be the pastor of the Lutheran Church and the other to be the pastor of the priest of the Anglican Church. So we've been doing this.
And one of the other things that we've been doing, the Anglican-Lutheran Joint Working Group, which is the national group charged with this process, we've literally been all across this country, and in whenever we've gathered in a particular place, we've always met with Anglican and Lutheran clergy and lay people. And the interesting thing is, Brad, that in many of these gatherings, it's more lay people who show up than clergy, who come asking questions and discovering each other. I've been in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, with a crowd of Anglicans and Lutherans, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Alberta, not in Alberta, but in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba, also in Ontario, particularly around Kitchener and Waterloo, where there's a strong Lutheran community. And lay people and clergy are talking about this. There are congregations that have joint study sessions to talk about the documents that we're preparing and to talk about their life together.
And I suppose in actual fact, by entering into that kind of a conversation, it's like learning a second language. We sort of understand our own first language better when we're learning a second, and we realize some of the things that we don't know or questions about it and so on. So do you find that by engaging in this kind of a shared conversation, do people actually learn more about their own original heritage?
Oh, sure. We need a glossary to understand each other. And,
sure.
And the booklet that we put together contains one.
Oh, you have so what are some of the terms in your glossary?
Well, Anglicans call their ministers priests, and we call them pastors to start with.
Okay.
We don't have wardens in our church, and deacons and archdeacons, and so we need a little glossary to help us understand where in the organization we're talking about these people. So things like that.
What about some of the theological terms, like things like grace, sin, priesthood of all believers, all kinds? We could go on, but those are just a few.
Well, ironically, the theological terms Anglicans and Lutherans already agree on.
Yeah.
So we found that most of our conversations revolved around the kind of structural language that we've used since the 16th century.
Really?
So I can remember sitting mystified at one meeting of the Anglican-Lutheran Joint Working Group while there was a representative of the Lutherans kept talking about, well, but will they be rostered? And I thought, well, of course they'll be rostered. People are on a list all the time. Well, what he meant by rostered is what I mean by licensed.
Okay.
So we found those kinds of terms. But things like justification by faith, Anglicans and Lutherans from the Reformation have agreed on justification by faith. Around the questions of grace, we've agreed. We fundamentally have no disagreement over the presence, how we describe the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. We have no disagreement about what happens in baptism in terms of our incorporation in Christ. We have some disagreement historically over an understanding of ordination. Only, as Ray's pointed out, in the Lutheran tradition of ordaining to one ministry, that of the what we would call the presbyterate, and in our tradition having three offices.
What are the three offices in the Anglican Church?
We have bishops, presbyters, and deacons, or sometimes called priests.
Right.
But we've always insisted that these three ministries share, in a sense, in one ordained ministry. So so these things have gone on.
And again, those are very different than sort of basic core beliefs. You're right. Those are structural things, which for the most part, I'm sure there's lots of people that have been Anglicans for all their life and don't know some of those things.
Exactly.
You know?
Well, or the other thing they don't know is, for example, one of my jobs early on was to go to the House of Bishops of the Anglican Church of Canada and to remind them that within the history of Anglicanism, we've held different views about bishops and the role of bishops in the life of the church. So I had to kind of go and give this kind of historical reminder that we have sometimes had different views about the role of bishops.
We have a similar history in the Lutheran Church. In Germany, there was a break from the episcopate because the bishops didn't come along with the reformers when they were cut loose. And so a break was made there from the historic order of ordination. But when the Reformation spread to the Scandinavian countries, their experience there was more like the experience in England. So they simply became the Church of Denmark or Norway or Sweden, but continued with their bishops and the same structure. And so in fact, the agreement between the Church of England and the churches in Northern Europe is different than the one in Canada because they share the historic episcopate among them.
And that's something that many people don't realize. At the present time, between the Anglican churches of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and the Baltic and Scandinavian Lutheran churches, there's a new agreement.
Anyway, we're out of time, but thank
Sure.
you both for helping to illuminate this. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I've been talking with Reverend Dr. Richard Leggett and Bishop Ray Schultz, and we've been talking about the Anglican-Lutheran Communion and two denominations working more closely together. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.